Sometimes the simplest questions are the hardest to answer. The other day I was in the Finance Committee where the government has asked parliamentarians to approve another $7 billion expenditure. They sent 10 government officials to tell us all of the wonderful things this $7 billion would do. I had a simple question. Where does the money come from? Silence blanketed the room. I sat quietly and patiently looking up at that Zoom screen to find out if a reassuring voice would answer an obvious and simple question. Of the 10 officials, we were told the majority were actually from the finance department. If any department should be able to tell you where the money comes from, you'd expect it to be finance. But silence continued to triumph, and the awkwardness thickened to the point that you could cut it with a knife. Finally, the chair tried to break in and encourage me to ask another question that might be easier for these 10 government officials to answer. I asked the chair then if he could tell us where the money comes from. He was likewise perplexed, sitting baffled in front of the committee, unaware of what to do. This being the chair of Canada's Parliamentary Finance Committee here in a G7 country. Now, of course, there are really only 4 places that money that passes through this House come from. 1, they can tax it. 2, they can borrow it. 3, they can print it. Or 4, God forbid, they can cut something else and reallocate the money. But none of those answers were forthcoming. Instead, a 5th novel explanation of the providence of this money came forward, finally, about 3 minutes into the long committee silence. And one official said this: the money is, quote, within the government's broader macroeconomic framework, and I cannot speak to that. Well, if $7 billion can appear magically from something called a government's broader macroeconomic framework, well, then everyone should have a macroeconomic framework. Imagine the things that a single mother could buy at the local grocery store if instead of having to rely on decreasingly valuable Canadian dollars to buy food for her kids, she could carry around with her a broader macroeconomic framework. Imagine if the worker who can't afford to gas up his car could just open up his wallet. Instead of pulling out increasingly worthless Canadian dollars, he could pull out a card with inscribed broader macroeconomic framework. Then he might even be able to fill up his tank with gas. Or maybe that 28-year-old who lives in his parents' basement, despite the fact that he has a good job because house price inflation has made it impossible for him to buy, if instead of using the inferior Canadian currency to bid on a house, he could walk up to the realtor and say, I've decided not to pay with cash, not even to pay with debt, but to pay with a broader macroeconomic framework card. So I would hope at the end of my remarks, a minister in the government will announce that just in time for Christmas gift purchases, they will mail out to every Canadian household a broader macroeconomic framework so that the parents can, in collaboration with Santa Claus, make sure that there are gifts under the tree for every child in these impossibly difficult times. Well, if we're going to ask the simple question of where the money comes from, why don't we ask the yet simpler question of what is money? Because sometimes it's important to go back to first principles in order to make sense of this crazy world of ours. Well, money, of course, is merely a technology by which we transport value over time and space. And without it, our species would have to consume in the present everything that it produces. Most species do. They have to eat what they kill right away, lest it be stolen or spoiled. Sure, squirrels can squirrel away a little bit, a good habit the government should learn from, but most species have to use it or lose it. We developed a technology that would allow two people who are exchanging things to go ahead with their exchange, even if each did not have the ability to supply the other with something that the other wanted. They could simply use this technology called money in order to transport the value between each other across time and around different geographies. And so over time, money has taken many forms. In one South Pacific island, it was just a ledger carved on scarce limestone. In some places, it's been beads or seashells. In prisons, they use cigarettes. In school, they used to use candy when I was a kid. Throughout history, it became metal, some precious, some brute. We had gold, we had silver, we had copper. Many different means of translating value across space and time have been used, but politicians have found it a nuisance to pay their bills using money with integrity, because back in 1215, poor old King John was forced by the barons and the commoners to sign this nuisance of a document called the Magna Carta, the Great Charter. And in that document was inscribed the principle that the crown could not tax what the people had not approved. And that principle is still in place here in this parliament today. Government can't spend what we don't vote on 800 years later. And you look around and see the beautiful green here. You know where that comes from, of course. It's because that was the color of the fields in which King John was made low. And that green should remind everyone that the people in the fields who are actually doing the work, they're the ones that produce the money that we spend around here. That might have been a better answer in the committee than a government's broader macroeconomic framework, Mr. Speaker. But I digress. But you see what happened after King John was prevented from going on taxing what people had not approved. He was forced to go back to the commoners to get their permission to take their money. He and his successors would become increasingly creative in sourcing the cash that they acquired. Years later, King Henry VIII, who is more famous for clipping off the heads of his subjects, decided that he could get his hands on money by clipping coins. He and his regime would clip off the edge of the coin, and that way they could melt those edges down and make more coins. And back then, it was hard to make coins because it was the British pound, which was a pound of silver. And by clipping off a piece, you could melt it down and create more coins, and John could inflate the value of currency in his hands, thereby deflating the value of the wages that his peasant class earned. He got even more creative later on. This is how he got his famous nickname. He would actually have his minters melt down the British pound, and he would re-mint it with just a tiny coat of silver around the outside of a copper coin. So people would think they were getting a silver coin. Meanwhile, on the inside, what they actually got was copper. The problem is, being the egomaniac that he was, facing outward from the coin, he didn't want a profile shot. His face was on the coin, and it stared everyone in the eye when they looked at that coin. But his nose protruded the farthest out, and when it was in people's pockets, it would rub against the inside of the pocket, and the silver would scrape off the tip of his nose, meaning that you'd have a silver coin with a red nose, and thus he got the nickname Old Copper Nose. And every time someone saw that red copper nose, they knew the king had stolen the real value of their money. Throughout time, other politicians have found other creative ways. The dictator Dionysius, who was a Greek dictator in Syracuse, he actually took all the coins, the 1 drachma coins, and he stamped them with a 2. So all of a sudden he had twice as much money. Now I hesitate to tell that story in this House because I worry that this Prime Minister might think that he could do the same. You know, if you run out of money, if you run out of money, he'll say, you can always get more. You'll turn loonies to toonies and toonies to fours. That might be the next creative idea by which government could get its hands on money. And throughout the 20th century, we saw this same tactic of cash creation in, of course, with the most famous example was in the early 1920s in Germany. They had created so many new units of account that inflation ran rapid out of control. You needed to have a wheelbarrow full of cash in order to buy a loaf of bread. And if you got to the bar to try and drink away your inflationary blues, you ordered all your beer at the beginning of the night because as the minutes went on, it became more expensive. And of course, we in this part of the world have not been immune to this inflationary disease ourselves. While the post-war era, we inherited monstrous debts fighting the fascists, but governments had hard money from the end of the war until the early 70s. We basically operated on an American-led standard whereby you could, if you had a U.S. greenback, you could exchange it at a rate of $35 per ounce of gold. And in that period, of course, we had an enormous amount of prosperity. The Americans paid off their war debts. Here in Canada, with solid currency, we wrestled the inflationary beast to the ground in the post-war era. We took our record debts that we inherited from the war, we paid them off, we increased the size of the Canadian economy by 300%, and by 1933, we had basically become a debt. In 1973, we had basically become a debt-free country. But then what happened in the 1970s? Well, President Nixon wanted to spend on warfare and welfare. Of course, the Americans were bogged down in Vietnam, which was costly an enterprise, and President Nixon wanted to keep his popularity at home, so he decided to spend. And in the decade that followed 1971, not only did they unleash the American dollar from any particular standard, but they increased the number of US dollars in circulation by 150%, while output only grew by about 39%. In other words, the amount of money grew about 4 times faster than the amount of underlying output that money represented. Now, here in Canada, we had Pierre Elliott Trudeau, and he looked down at all the inflation that the US government was creating. They had reached double-digit inflation down there, a total inflationary crisis. The American dollar was devalued on an international basis and, of course, was incapable of buying affordable petroleum on the world market. They liked to blame OPEC, but they took no responsibility for the fact that the unit with which they were buying oil on the international markets was itself devalued. So Trudeau says, he looks down at all the misery in the United States. He looked at how people were lined up at gas stations, trying to wait for an hour and a half in order to gas up their cars. He saw the poverty that was overtaking inner city streets. He saw the expanding wealth gap in the United States of America. And what did Pierre Elliott Trudeau say to all that? He said, let's have some of that up here. And so he started printing some money here in Canada and massively increased the money supply with which Canada, I just have the data right here. Between 1971 and 1981, the money supply in Canada grew by over 200%, while GDP only grew in real terms by about 47%. So you can imagine, money is growing in supply at more than 4 times the rate as the economy is growing. So you have more dollars chasing fewer goods, and what do you get? Inflation. That's right. That is, we learned that, all of us, we learned that in grade school, but apparently some lessons need to be learned and relearned here in this House of Commons. And so what happened was inflation hit by the early 1980s. Inflation had risen to 12% in Canada. Now, the government claimed that if they kept printing money, this would stimulate the economy and create jobs. Well, what did it deliver? 12% unemployment. 12% inflation, 12% unemployment. Worth spending a minute on this here. Why is it that high inflation actually kills jobs, contrary to what the so-called experts always tell us? Well, the answer is because what are prices? Prices are information. Prices are some of the most powerful and condensed forms of information ever known to humankind. The great economist Milton Friedman explained how complicated it is to make a pencil. He basically said the lead comes from a lead mine in Asia, the rubber comes from a rubber tree in another part of the world, the timber might come from a forest in the western United States, the paint might come from a titanium mine somewhere in Africa, and all these people are working together to make a pencil. None of them actually know they're making a pencil, but they agree to make the ingredients of the pencil. Why? Because they're zapped with a laser beam called the price signal. The price is high enough to incentivize them to make the investments, to do the work, to supply the goods. And the consumer knows what it costs to make that pencil. Why? Not because he called to all the mines and he called out over to the forest and asked them all to feed in the price and pull out his calculator and figured out what it should cost to make a pencil. No, because when he walked in to the store, there was a price, and that price basically zapped to him the cost of making the pencil, and the hundreds of people who had unknowingly conspired to make it communicated that information to the buyer just like that, and then he calculated in his mind that the pencil was worth more than the money he had to spend to get it, and therefore all of those laser beams led to that wonderful little transaction that brought him home a pencil. Here's the problem with inflation. It messes with all of those information signals. Just last week, I was in New Brunswick, and I was speaking to a gentleman who's in a recycling business. He signs 5-year agreements to do recycling work for other companies. Here's the problem. When you don't know what the price is going to be over the next 5 years, you don't know what you should charge. He locked in contracts that expected inflation to be the normal 2%. Now, we've got 5% inflation and potentially rising. What is the difference? Well, over a 5-year period, instead of having 10% total inflation, it will be closer to 25, or with compounded interest, 30%. So now he's getting actually 20% less in his 5th year than he actually thought he was going to get. So all of these information signals that tell that allow people to exchange work for wages, product for payment, and investment for interest are totally scrambled by inflation. The technology that is supposed to allow us to transport value through space and time is scrambled. It's like scrambling the hard drive on a computer. And all of these mixed signals mess with the ability of humans to exchange value with one another. And when that system breaks down, everything breaks down. That is why inflation has almost always led to social disorder. It also allows those with the greatest means to profit the most. Why? Because they can move their money into things that are inflation protected, like land, buildings, private businesses, stocks, bonds, and countless other assets that inflate in price. Meanwhile, the people who actually live off their wages see a real pay cut. Those people who are wealthy enough not only profit by watching their assets inflate in value, but the real value of the debts that they take on shrinks in inflation-adjusted terms. And so what happens? Those who have access to the financial system get vastly richer as their debts shrink in real value and their assets inflate. And those who do the work, the people in the fields, for whom we painted these floors green, they watch the fruits of their labors withered away by this inflation. And so, Madam Chair, I rise today to call for a restoration of the real integrity of our money, to bring back the meaning of money, which is to transport value over space and time, to restore free markets among free people, and to put the commoner ahead of the crown. Thank you.